AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with senior U.S. intelligence officers. And today I'm delighted to welcome back a good friend and colleague by the name of David Robarge. David got his PhD in American history from Columbia University. And after teaching at Columbia and working for David Rockefeller, he joined the CIA in 1989 and became a political and leadership analyst on the Middle East. In 1996, he switched to the CIA history staff, and in 2005, he was appointed the senior historian for the CIA. Over the years, David has written a whole series of classified works and unclassified articles that have appeared in a variety of journals, including CIA's Studies in Intelligence. His biography of DCI John McCone has recently been declassified. He's also written a biography of former Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, and he's got more recently a book out on George C. Marshall, which will be the topic of today's discussion, and it is entitled The Soldier-Statesman in the Secret World. David, welcome back to AFIO Now.
Well, thank you, Jim. A pleasure to be here again to talk about one of my latest projects. Thank you for having me.
David, why would a historian write a book about George C. Marshall?
Well, probably a better question is, why would a CIA historian write about George C. Marshall? And it comes down to, without being too flip about it, COVID and boredom. My office was put on the sidelines during the first several months of the COVID epidemic. So I was sent home and left with not a whole lot to do except catch up on my reading and do some chores around the house. Well, about 2 weeks after that, I got pretty bored and I got the itch to do some kind of historical writing and research. I thought around for some topics that I could do totally unclassified and at home, because you couldn't go to libraries, you couldn't get anything anywhere at that point. So I dusted off some notes I had used for a presentation out at the George Marshall House in Leesburg a number of years before, with the idea that I could expand them into an article-length piece for studies, most likely. As any historian knows, once you start looking into a subject, you find all sorts of research rabbit holes to go down. And before I knew it, the article was expanding into something much longer and eventually into a book. I was also blessed by the fact that the George Marshall Archive down in Lexington was open every other week, and everything that it had that I needed was pretty much digitized. So between conversations with the archivist there and being able to access all of the digitized holdings, plus all sorts of other things that are available online, military records, published histories, official accounts and things, I was able to do within a 5 or 6 month period a pretty thorough set of research. And then we started going back to the office every other week. So then I was able to start tapping into hard copy libraries and some of the agency's own material. And that's how the book eventually came about.
What was the state of intelligence at DOD at the beginning of World War II? And what did Marshall do to try to improve both collection and dissemination?
Now, one of the theses of my book, at least as it covers World War II, it also discusses him as Secretary of State and Defense, which we'll get to later. I wanted to test the premise that he, being the much lauded organizer of victory as Chief of Staff of the Army during World War II, the question was, did he do the same thing for intelligence? We know that in personnel and training and logistics and all of that and operational planning, he was exceptionally adept. But did he accomplish the same thing with intelligence. And we're starting out with a very low bar to get over. I'll read a brief excerpt from the book, if I may. This is from Dwight Eisenhower's memoir written in 1948. And he's recalling how awful military intelligence was when he became chief of staff, or even earlier when he was head of the Allied forces in Europe. He says, within the War Department, a shocking deficiency that impeded all constructive planning existed in the field of intelligence. The fault was partly within and partly without the Army. The American public has always viewed with repugnance everything that smacks of the spy. And during the years between the two world wars, no funds were provided with which to establish the basic requirements of an intelligence system, a far-flung organization of fact-finders. And on top of that, once you collect the information, you have to develop some mechanism for analyzing it, processing it, and getting it to the hands of the customers. And that's something that Marshall surprisingly fell a bit short on. I was somewhat surprised to see that he didn't spend a lot of time with intelligence. He didn't have any prior experience with it. In fact, as I point out in the book, a couple of experiences he had with it back in World War I when he was with the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe were not very productive for him. He walked away shaking his head, in effect saying, I didn't get anything useful out of this. But when it comes to managing the Army intelligence component, G2, over which he had direct authority as Chief of Staff of the Army, he did relatively little, surprisingly to me. We had serious problems with the attaché system. It was a dumping ground for underachievers, a way station for people to take positions while they were trying to find something more desirable, and not a whole lot got done. The head of G2 changed 4 times while Marshall was Chief of Staff. And though he came toward the end of the war to appreciate some of the value of it, he himself indicated that he really didn't get much out of it by the end of the war. Again, let me read you a couple of quotes from the book. Here is Marshall himself indicating that he didn't have the resources, he didn't have the expertise that he needed. We didn't have nearly enough men in the intelligence section. It always got the second deal in it, that is, people who didn't really want to be there. He says, G2 let me down every time in everything. They never told me what I needed to know. They didn't tell me about the hedgerows in Normandy, and it was not until later, after much bloodshed, that we were able to deal with them. So all in all, his efforts to confront this pretty parlous state of intelligence, at least within the Army itself, was not very productive. He instituted some organizational changes that centralized authorities within the service commands, but again, not keeping a close eye out on intelligence per se, with one exception, which we can get to in a little bit. He was very interested in communications intelligence. And the one component within G2 that was working on that was the Signal Intelligence Service. And one of the organizational changes that he made was to try to get SIS out of the Signal Corps and more directly in sync with the intelligence components, the Military Intelligence Division and later the Military Intelligence Service. That became a bit of a bureaucratic tussle, and not all that much was resolved as a result of that. In short, I was a little disappointed when I finished looking at him as the organizer of intelligence, because within a couple of accepted areas, he really didn't accomplish all that much, and his contemporaries share that view.
Marshall's relationship with, and was he supportive of OSS?
One of Marshall's leadership motifs throughout his military career was chain of command, making sure that you had clear-cut lines of authority and that underlings were not going to go off and freelance and get other people in trouble, particularly their superiors. That was his main concern with OSS, that Donovan wanted to have an independent espionage and intelligence organization that reported only to the White House. The Joint Chiefs resisted this, Marshall resisted this, and until it became clear that the OSS would report to the JCS and by indirection then to the president, Marshall wasn't satisfied. Once that was all resolved, he was willing to let OSS have a bit of free rein, particularly in areas where the U.S. military did not have a conventional presence. Also, he made sure that anytime the OSS was supporting U.S. or allied military operations anywhere, that it was always subordinate to the regional commanders, the theater commanders. He didn't have a close relationship with Donovan. He was acquainted with him before the war a little bit, so that didn't become an important factor. Later on, when Donovan wanted to pursue the idea of a permanent civilian-based peacetime intelligence organization, Marshall was in favor of it. He thought that that would be important to have. He knew that the Army and the Navy, despite some efforts to reduce the rivalries between them in the intelligence domain, were still going to be rivals, that it would be good to have an independent OSS-type agency after the war that reported to someone. It's not clear at that point who it would have been. The NSC hadn't been created yet, of course. And so Marshall is on the record of supporting the concept. However, when Donovan's opponents mobilized against him, when the military services, the traditionalists in the military services, the FBI, and others, that created a political controversy that Marshall wanted to stay out of. He was always trying to avoid political controversies wherever he could throughout his later career. And as a result, he backed off from supporting Donovan. Beyond that, I think their relationship was professional, cordial. Marshall praised OSS's accomplishments occasionally and had the general idea that a standing intelligence organization was a good thing. But when it became too hot a political issue, he backed off from it.
You alluded to it earlier. What impact did Marshall have on SIGINT collection?
Marshall appreciated very early on the value of SIGINT. He knew it was essential for operational and tactical planning. He knew that it had to be kept highly secure to avoid disasters in campaigns. He was very impressed early on with the fact that his code-breaking component, Signal Intelligence Service, had reverse engineered the Japanese encryption machine that we called Purple. He got a test of that, was highly impressed. He wanted the Secretary of War, Stimson, to be similarly impressed. And that's one of the running themes that I did find pretty fascinating in my research, was Marshall's devotion to signals intelligence. He worked to develop products that highlighted the accomplishments of the collectors and the cryptanalysts. He had a daily briefing about it. The office that produced it created something called the Magic Summaries. This was the material collected from the Japanese system. That was taken to the White House regularly. Marshall, if something particularly hot and juicy was in there, he made sure Roosevelt got a look at it. Security was a crucial matter, of course. And one of his accomplishments was maintaining that security throughout. Now, some people, if we'll get to Pearl Harbor, I'm sure later, some people complained that he was too secure when it came to handling magic. And that was one of the reasons why people were surprised on December 7th, 1941, because they simply didn't have access to the traffic. We'll get to that later, I hope, because it's worth some discussion and elaboration on its own. A couple of other things to think about in the SIGINT area. He was involved not just with the Japanese material Magic, but also with the German material from the Ultra system. Again, how to get it to people in the field so they could use it and maintain its security. The British had set up an operation that had used special security officers, SSOs, who were detailed to British units to make sure that though those officers knew the ultimate source of the material, it was never disclosed to people down the chain to maintain security. Marshall liked that model, and he had it replicated in the European theater. Also, it was used in the Far Eastern theater with a different impact because of MacArthur running his own independent SIGINT system organization out there out of Australia. Another thing that Marshall had to deal with was, at what point do you share this information with your ally, the Soviet Union, without disclosing what you have accomplished in breaking adversary encryption systems? So eventually, around 1943 or so, Marshall and the British agree that SIGINT will be provided to the Soviets, who are bearing the brunt of the fighting in Europe at the time, as you know, but the ultimate source of the material would never be disclosed. Ironically, the Soviets already knew what the ultimate source of the material was, because they had a spy at the General Cipher School that was the British were using as their SIGINT decryption organization, penetration in effect of Bletchley Park. So just as Stalin knew ahead of time about the atomic bomb, he also knew ahead of time about Ultra. But Marshall, of course, not being witting of that, went ahead and provided the information without attribution. In the Pacific Theater, as I'd mentioned, he had difficulties with MacArthur. Of course, everybody had difficulties with MacArthur. And in some cases, this had overtones of personal conflict. Way back some years before, when MacArthur was Army Chief of Staff, Marshall was just a lowly lieutenant colonel. And then suddenly, as of 1939, Marshall is catapulted into the Chief of Staff position, and now MacArthur, in effect, works for him. It's interesting to look at the two's relationship. It was obviously frosty. MacArthur pushed back whenever he could against efforts to gain some insights into what his SIGINT service was doing out there. You're also aware, I'm sure, that he prevented OSS from operating anywhere near where he had any command. So Marshall is looking for ways to finesse this prickly relationship. Some people thought he went too far in bending over backwards to accommodate MacArthur, that he was afraid of taking on this great war hero and such. It was a difficult time for Marshall by any means, and never was really fully resolved ultimately in the end. The other thing I'll mention before we move on to something else is the establishment of a liaison and collaboration relationship with the British regarding Ultra. The British did not trust American security. They thought OSS was leaky. They didn't trust the military security services. Consequently, they were very reluctant to share raw Ultra material with anybody. That's the reason why eventually OSS had to create its counterintelligence division called X2, that was in effect a service within a service, so that the British would share Ultra traffic, not just analyses or interpretations. Now, Marshall did not have that similar access, but what he did accomplish was helping smooth the way to a communications intelligence sharing agreement with the British called BRUSA, Britain and USA SIGINT sharing. That came about in 1943 after some ups and downs over the preceding years, and it eventually, at the end of the war, became cemented into the UKUSA agreement, UK-USA agreement, a long-running, to this date, communications or SIGINT intelligence sharing agreement that has its foundations back in the mid-World War II period.
You mentioned earlier that there were actually multiple inquiries into Pearl Harbor. What impact did that have on Marshall, both during the war and afterwards?
For Marshall, it was a very mixed picture. We had 8 investigations. 6 of them he got directly involved with. 2 of them were very service-centric, and he wasn't questioned during them. As the Pearl Harbor controversy developed throughout the 1940s, it turned into really a lot of blame gaming, in which people were trying to find individuals further down the chain of command they could pin the whole disaster on. Kimmel and Short eventually became the patsies, if you want to call them that. What Marshall got involved with in the course of these investigations is an attempt to clarify a number of information handling and acquisition issues that became very, very controversial. In other words, did we have forewarning? Were we, in effect, asleep at the wheel? Could we have done more to prevent the disaster? and so forth. And where is Marshall's role in this? One of the controversies was, did he adequately forewarn people in his chain of command that an attack was coming? I think the record shows that he did. The problem here is that very few people thought that Pearl Harbor was going to be the target of the Japanese attack. The bulk of intelligence at that time, leading up to December 7th, indicated that the Japanese were going to move elsewhere in the Pacific region, either heading south into the Indies or possibly moving toward the Philippines or something like that. Pearl Harbor was simply not high on the list. We all know various reasons why we were caught off guard there. Some of them are prejudices against Japanese military prowess, a greater sense of security, and so forth. That was unwarranted, obviously. But the main point here is that when Marshall issued orders to his people in the chain of command, individuals who were in other locales like the Panama Canal Zone, the Western Pacific, and such, everybody was warned that some kind of military action might occur, but no specific target was specified. So I think the warning was there. It just simply didn't translate into Pearl Harbor as the ultimate destination of the Japanese fleet. Another complaint that came up in the inquiries is that Marshall instituted such tight security over the handling of magic that people who should have had access to it did not. Probably so. He did not trust even his own security communications channels. For example, in the days immediately before December 7th, when it seemed clear that some kind of warning was indicated, and then especially on the 7th itself, Marshall did not use the Army communications channels because he thought they were insecure, and he didn't want to broadcast over them some kind of warmongering message that might be misinterpreted. As a result, the warning directly to Pearl Harbor didn't get there until after the attacks were underway. You also have this lingering controversy about whether the U.S. cryptanalytics services, either the Army or the Navy, had intercepted and decrypted a very clear warning message. This is the winds code message. This supposedly was going to be the one that indicated directly that an attack was imminent, and it was going to identify whether the U.S. or the British or the Soviets or Russia was the target. This has been investigated to death. A lot of conspiracy theories have developed around it. I think they've been definitively put to rest by historians up at the National Security Agency, who indicate that no such winds code message ever was transmitted, intercepted, and then lost or burned or covered up in some effort to shift blame. That became a theme in some of the subsequent inquiries later in the war, particularly the Joint Congressional Inquiry, at which Marshall was interrogated for dozens and dozens of hours over the course of some days. He came off not looking very well. He was supposedly gifted with a phenomenal memory, but when you read the transcripts, you get a lot of, I don't recall, I'm not sure, I wasn't there, I can't remember, kind of hemming and hawing. To his credit, what he didn't want to do was get a hold of all the information in the previous investigations, bone up on some answers, and then deliver them. He wanted to take it really honestly. This is what I can recall. I haven't studied. I'm not looking back over the record and cherry picking information. This is me, in effect, unplugged. And it didn't come off very well. He wound up suffering a bit in his public reputation. He did offer at a point to resign. Secretary Simpson said, forget it. And he came off afterward with a reputation a little bit diminished. It was also a rough time for him because he was also preparing to go off on his mission to China. And so he had a lot of other concerns on his mind at the time. Also, the Joint Congressional investigation was highly politicized. even though the people on the committees were reputable individuals with many with military experience, and they weren't like Joe McCarthy or anybody like that. Nonetheless, it was a large effort to make the Roosevelt administration look fairly poor from the minority perspective. The committee was picked with members from both chambers. A partisan balance was attempted, but the minority report especially was very condemnatory of Marshall's handling and all the senior leadership's handling of it. It became a real political hot potato at the time, and Truman was left to figure out how to take care of it.
Yeah. What was Marshall's involvement in the Manhattan Project?
The Manhattan Project was administratively under the Army. It was an effort to hide this huge budget. The Manhattan Project was the biggest scientific research and development program ever. Dozens of billions of dollars were spent on it in real terms now, and the money had to be hidden somewhere. So it was stuck in the Army budget. Marshall had, of course, as Chief of Staff, general oversight, but in typical leadership style fashion of his, he picked a highly competent subordinate and told them to go do their jobs, and made sure that he had the resources and personnel he needed and the political cover if something controversial arose. That was Leslie Groves, who had just finished building the Pentagon. Groves performed, I think, by most accounts, very, very well in running this project. So it's important to understand that Marshall was one of the few leaders in the Roosevelt administration who knew about the atomic bomb from start to finish. And as it's being developed, he wants to find out, of course, what the adversaries are doing about it. The Germans, do they have their own nuclear program? He had known that the British were investigating that, and Marshall set up a similar operation called the Alsace Mission, which was a dedicated intelligence unit inside the Army that traveled into German-held territory with the Allied forces and was responsible for collecting intelligence, personnel, and equipment related to the German atomic program. It was a very successful mission, and it reached the conclusion around 1943 that the Germans didn't have any kind of development program to speak of, that they were years and years away, and it was something that we just didn't have to worry about. Along the way, a couple of interesting developments arise, one involving OSS. The idea that capturing the Germans' top physicist, a Nobel laureate named Werner Heisenberg, would be an important achievement. If you take the Einstein of the German program out of commission, then you've dealt it a serious blow. There are even plans potentially to assassinate Heisenberg. This is all going to be done by this well-known OSS operative named Moe Berg, a former professional ball player, multilingual, not much of a ball player. He was a better agent than he was on the diamond. And he was going to follow Heisenberg around. And if it seemed like at a particular conference, Heisenberg was clearly indicating that the Germans were well on to getting an A-bomb, Berg was authorized to kill him. Marshall apparently knew knew about this ahead of time, and just winked and nodded and said, let Groves do his own dirty work, if that's how it's going to come off. He also supported the targeted killing of German scientists, mass bombings of scientific and research facilities, no particular concern with collateral damage, better to get rid of the German scientists than let them continue their work, even if it meant some civilians perished in the course of this. So a couple of big operations were launched to accomplish exactly that. Well, when the bomb is finally ready, Marshall is initially a bit ambivalent about it. He starts to wonder whether we should have a test, whether we should confine the bombing to a military location or an industrial location. Even though we had the Dresden fire bombings and the Tokyo fire bombings, he was a little cautious about this because he felt that this atomic weapon put warfare on a different moral plane. He was prevailed upon, though, to agree to bomb some major cities. Secretary Stimson ruled out Kyoto because of its cultural significance. They figured we bombed Tokyo enough and we don't want to risk killing the emperor, so let's go for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And one of the big factors in Marshall's support ultimately for using the atomic bomb came through intelligence. Because of our breaks into the Japanese encryption systems, we knew a lot about what they were thinking, what they were planning, how they were going to resist the invasion of the home islands. They were steeling themselves. They were making preparations for a do or die defense of the homeland. And we knew from the recent experiences with the island hopping operations like at Iwo Jima and Okinawa that they were going to exact a major cost against us, possibly 1 million casualties in the initial invasion. So that really tipped Marshall's hand when it came to deciding that we did need to use the bomb. So therein, again, another important contribution of signals intelligence to Marshall's decisions.
David, how successful was Marshall's China mission and why?
Right. So the China mission's ultimate purpose was to try to bring together two irreconcilable factions, the Kuomintang, the nationalists, and the Chinese Communist Party under Mao. Marshall was given this highly difficult assignment right after he stepped down as Army Chief of Staff. Within a day, Truman was on the phone asking him to go solve the China problem. It turned out to be unsuccessful. And Marshall realized at the end of the day that neither side was really serious about reaching a compromise, that Chiang Kai-shek knew that when push came to shove, the Truman administration would support him, not the communists, of course. So Marshall was really not there as a neutral arbiter. He was there, in effect, as an advocate for a particular U.S. foreign policy initiative. When he got there, he found that American intelligence was a muddle. Lots of different organizations, military and civilian, running independent operation and analytical activities. He was very dissatisfied with what he found. Characteristically, he tried to centralize it, make sure that the competition among the providers of the intelligence was minimized, and did a reasonable job of that. In the course of the negotiations, he found both sides, as I said, to be pretty obdurate. He developed an interesting relationship with Zhou Enlai, who was the lead communist negotiator. He respected Zhou Enlai. At one point, remarkably, the Americans came upon Zhou Enlai's code book that he had inadvertently left on an airplane. Now, what were you going to do with this find? This would be gold. You could roll up the entire CCP network. And Marshall knew well that the nationalists were spying on the communists were spying on the nationalists, the communists were spying on the U.S., and we were spying on both of them. So it was a real espionage circus over there. But here you have this potential gold mine of information that could break the entire CCP network. And what does Marshall do? He has it wrapped up and returned to Zhou Enlai with no indication whatsoever that it had been read, exploited, copied, or anything else. People would later criticize Marshall for naivete, for going too far to try to placate the communists and such. But it didn't matter what he did. Neither side was really interested in an agreement. He had some initial successes. He did, after a few months, get them to institute a ceasefire. That didn't last. And by about 16 months or so, he's ready to pack it in. And he tells Truman this simply isn't going to work. And back he goes to the United States to become Secretary of State. The poor guy never got any rest whatsoever.
What was the close call that Marshall and other Americans experienced in Bogota in 1948? And what was the role of Vernon Walter?
Okay. Marshall was down in Bogota in 1948 to attend an international conference that ultimately led to the Organization of American States. But just before he got there, Bogota especially became a hotbed of protest, some of it communist inspired, some of it just simply political rivals going after each other. And Marshall was forewarned, maybe you should stay away. This is kind of a dangerous place. And he says, forget it. I'm committed to this conference and I'm going to go. So no sooner is he down there than the whole place starts riots and protests and killings and bodies in the streets and buildings of fire. It's a big mess. It was called the Bogotazo, this episode. And the issue then becomes, well, is this a big intelligence failure? Should we have known that this was going to happen when Marshall was there? Didn't we have any indicators of the sort? And here you get into a bureaucratic wrangle between state and the new CIA formed in 47 about who knew what when and who told what to whom. It basically comes down to a muddled communication protocol in which the ranking American intelligence representative in Colombia was supposed to not go directly to Washington and report to the director of Central Intelligence, but to go through the State Department. And this, of course, would make the State Department look bad. So what you wind up having is a congressional investigation. And poor DCI Roscoe Hillenkoetter is there on the hot seat trying to show that this wasn't an intelligence failure, that it really was the State Department's fault, that the CIA had provided forewarning, et cetera, et cetera. It was a very typical Washington blame game scenario. And because of a few other things that happened in the next year or two, Hillenkoetter winds up getting bounced as DCI. While Marshall is down there, Vernon Walters, who was one of his senior military assistants, provided an interesting anecdote about how Marshall directed a small contingent of Colombian military people who were sent to the house he was staying in to protect it from the riots in the streets. And he starts to wonder whether these people really know what they're doing. They had deployed this small squad of people in an inept fashion that wouldn't accomplish what they were supposed to do. So he gets the lieutenant in charge, and with Vernon Walters interpreting, sets him straight about how to do this small tactical security operation, where to put people, how to guard the perimeter, and all of this. As Walters recounts in his memoir, Marshall was drawing on his small unit tactics training from decades before to wind up keeping himself secure while the riots are going on the outside.
What was the second Red Scare, and how was Marshall involved?
By way of background, we want to associate all of this security mania in that's probably an overstatement because a lot of it was justified. In the late 40s and early 50s, a lot of Americans were highly concerned about subversion by communists and fellow travelers. Now, this period of time, which started around 1946, before McCarthy, this is not the McCarthy period, this is all pre-McCarthy, it is a result of President Truman trying to rationalize some rather contradictory and ineffective security protocols that had been instituted during World War II. So he signs an executive order that establishes a security regimen in the U.S. government, loyalty tests, in effect, whereby people have to, if they want a job or if they want to stay on a job, pledge that they have never been involved with anything subversive. They were not members of various political parties or subversive organizations. And if it was found out later that they were lying at any point in this process, they could be dismissed. And the State Department also had a little bit of a shaky reputation for security. It had already been involved in a couple of scandals. So when Marshall becomes Secretary of State in 47, he dutifully carries out the executive order, almost to a fault. He winds up approving the dismissals of individuals, not necessarily with due process. Some of those wound up being rehired when the political storm built over it. Marshall is also concerned about whether he's gone too far. He tries to point out to the State Department employees that this isn't a witch hunt, that he's going to practice appropriate measures to prevent people from being scandalized or victimized. It doesn't play out all that well, particularly. And probably in retrospect, he might have gone overboard. Now, later on, ironically, he becomes the target of a lot of right-wing criticisms because of his handling of the China mission, and secondly, because of supposed laxness while he's carrying out this security routine. This is the who lost China debate, as if China was ours to lose. But that became one of the taglines of the day. And the question here is, was the State Department filled with, in effect, either proto-communists or Maoist sympathizers, the so-called China hands, who were leading the policy and political discussion about what to do over there, not only at the time that Marshall was on the mission, but also later? These are career Foreign Service officers. Interestingly, the three main ones all had similar type names: John Patton Davies, John Stewart Service, and John Carter Vincent. Interesting. I don't know why they all used their full names all the time, but that was what happened. And Edmund Chubb, not very well known, but also a senior China hand. All of these individuals wind up getting railroaded out of the service because of their perceived pro-communist sympathies. In Service's case, he was reinstituted by judicial action, but he declined. In another case, I forget which one of the Johns it was, but he was offered a less important job and refused to take it. What I found interesting here is that all of this is occurring after Marshall is out of the State Department, but a lot of it while he is Secretary of Defense from 1950 to 51. And though he sympathized with all of these China hands' attitudes, he did absolutely nothing privately, importantly, or publicly, understandably perhaps, to champion them, to defend them. I found this, I can see why when he's Secretary of Defense, he doesn't want to do anything publicly, especially after taking a lot of heat for supporting MacArthur's dismissal for insubordination against Truman. But even privately, he never sent any of these individuals a confidential letter expressing support. It just struck me as an odd situation for him to avoid. I didn't see any particular reason for it. Maybe he was afraid they would leak the letters and try to bask in the innocence by association with Marshall, but it was a puzzle to me. The second irony is that Marshall becomes one of Joe McCarthy's main targets in this who lost China debate. And the famous quote that McCarthy later made after he introduced his list of subversives in Wheeling, West Virginia in 51, the conspiracy so immense quote. And he's targeting Marshall. Now, he had a couple of opportunities. One was when Marshall was appointed Secretary of Defense, the Congress had to pass a waiver because under the National Security Act, an individual could not be Secretary of Defense if they had been an active duty military officer within the past 10 years. Congress passed the waiver, but this was a debate that enabled McCarthy and a couple of other like-minded individuals to just go after Marshall bitterly. And then during the confirmation hearing to be Secretary of Defense, again, he's in the crosshairs. He doesn't publicly respond to any of this and probably figured that, as Eisenhower did, I believe, McCarthy would eventually self-immolate, that he would just go way too far with some of his allegations and politically destroy himself. We know that eventually happened, but it took a longer time than perhaps Marshall expected. That's the role that he had in the second Red Scare. It's a mixed picture, as I say, but so oftentimes when you have these paragons, you start looking in other parts of their careers, you find some very interesting inconsistencies and irregularities. and this is just one of them.
Well, it's a very thorough and scholarly treatment of the subject. The title again is The Soldier-Statesman in the Secret World. And I want to thank David Robarge for a great presentation.
Thank you, Jim. Those of you who are interested in the book, you can download it from the CIA public website at cia.gov. Look in the publications section, and there it is. Also, if you want hard copies, you can write to the Center for the Study of Intelligence at CIA, Washington, D.C. 20505 and request a hard copy.
Thanks again, David.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.